You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next 60 minutes, we are going to be talking about Series 9, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I'm Simon.
Before we get stuck into Series 9, and there's a lot of it to get stuck into, so I'm limiting us to 2.5 minutes per story, okay? You got that, you two?
Okay.
No waffle, Matt, no waffle.
Okay.
So I'm waffling already, aren't I? Logan's Look. Not quite the final edition, but we're getting very, very close. This is the last, as things stand. Hi, strangers. Here are Logan's comments on the second half of Flux. Logan, of course, is a 10-year-old who's watching through all of Doctor Who in order with his dad, and his dad is sending us Logan's annotated feedback. Village of the Angels, this episode was good, and I like how it focused on just one plot, like the Sontaran episode did. It was nice to see the Weeping Angels back again, but I found it strange how the angels are now able to talk. I liked how the angels could come out of devices and paper drawings. It was interesting how the angel was inside Claire, and it was pretty good how the angel said it could give the Doctor all the information that she couldn't remember about the division. I didn't expect the Doctor to start turning into a weeping angel at the end of the episode. The scene in the middle of the end credits was good. Survivors of the Flux. This episode was good. The Doctor being at Division outside of our universe and learning more about her past and meeting Tecteun again was interesting. I liked how Yaz, Dan and Professor Jericho travelled all over the world trying to find solutions to help save Earth. It was an interesting plot point how the Great Serpent had infiltrated UNIT over the years and how he was working for the Sontarans. You know, all the stuff that fans were moaning about in those two episodes is not the stuff that bothered Logan by the sound of it. Anyway, the Vanquishers. This episode was decent, but it was odd how the Doctor was in 3 different places. I know, no good this time, but decent. Mind you, in Australia, I don't know if decent's better than good.
I don't know. I've only ever heard him describe stories as good.
When Australians say
strange.
When Australians say they quite liked something, that means more than they liked something. Whereas over here in the UK, when you say you quite like something, that means you didn't really. Anyway, the Vanquishers, this episode was decent, but it was odd how the Doctor was in 3 different places. It was good that the Sontarans were the main villains, but it could have been better as they had already been the main villains in the second episode. It seemed unrealistic that the Sontarans would be able to bring the Daleks and Cybermen in to discuss a truce. I like how there were 2 Doctors working together, as we haven't seen that in a while. It was smart how they used the passenger to absorb the flux and save the day. Swarm and Azure were interesting, and I thought the Doctor might open the fob watch to find out about her previous lives. Logan's comments on the series as a whole. My favourite episodes of the series were the Sontaran one and the Weeping Angels episode, while my least favourite was Once Upon Time. I am not at all surprised that the Daleks are going to be back in the New Year's Day special again, like the other ones. Score, though, for Flux as a whole, 85 out of 100. Regards, Adrian. So we'll get another edition of Logan's Look, possibly the final one, later in the year, once we've got the Sea Devils episode, maybe the Abominable Snowmen animation, perhaps, and of course Eve of the Daleks we've not heard about yet. And I suppose potentially, if it's long enough, we might also get the Regeneration special as well in the autumn. We'll have to see. But for now, I think it's goodbye Logan for a little bit. Series 9 then. We got 9 stories because I divided it up that way. The lowest in terms of the voting got 10%. So it wasn't a complete write-off, but that is quite low, really. The highest got 80.4%. So it wasn't a particularly high, but the top 3 or 4 stories seemed to get a lot more of the vote than the sort of bottom 5. So it was a very top-heavy vote, really. We've got tons and tons of listener feedback, so I will dive straight in with that. Feel free to interrupt occasionally just to give me a chance to breathe. Phil Markham says, mixed bag of a season. Good season opener. Saigon 2-parter was superb. There is so much more to that story than just the speech, and a wonderful finale. The rest I've probably only watched once. Alistair Thwaite says this season, but especially Zygon Inversion and Heaven Sent, makes a compelling case for Capaldi being the most accomplished actor ever to play the Doctor. Can't argue with that. Rod Brown, all three Capaldi seasons are simply magnificent. There's no complacency at any point, with each trying something bold and new. As a lead, Capaldi cannot be faulted, and Clara is a thoroughly engaging companion. Thus, I find these stories really hard to rank. Jimmy Twizzle, never sure why this series gets a hard time. My personal favourite of the Capaldi years. A great improvement on season 8, which was very patchy with a poor conclusion, and personally not keen on all the monk episodes in the middle of season 10. I think this season far more level and quality. Some may argue that Clara stayed around too long, but I feel her ending here, although delayed in conclusion, is fitting and moving. Pat Howe says the most consistent series of the modern show. Even the weakest stories are very watchable, and Capaldi is excellent. George Machin, my favourite series of Doctor Who. There's genuinely not a single dud for me in the bunch. Yes, I even like Sleep No More. Heaven Sent is my favourite episode of all Doctor Who and might be a contender for my all-time favourite piece of any media. Lance Harrington, a great season with a lot of quality. Even the bottom of the list isn't awful, although The Woman Who Lived is a bit boring. Adric Marks. Right, I'm going to have to take a quick sip of water before I get into this one, because I haven't edited him, even though he told me I probably should. He says, does Adric Marks, I'm in the minority that found the 12th Doctor maddening and will never understand how the 6th Doctor was derided for his personality and bombastic behaviour, and yet the 12th Doctor can be worse, especially during this season and the previous one, and even more arrogant, and yet somehow everyone, critics and audiences, loves him, of which I personally have never understood and found to be relatively hypocritical at times. Heaven Sent was one of the most egregious, self-indulgent wastes of time that I feel the show has ever produced. Why the show at this point insisted on generating mysteries such as the Doctor's name when we would never be given a definitive answer, let alone creating psychological issues that will also hardly bear fruit in the long run, remains a mystery to me, other than a writer's hubris at projecting their own beliefs on the show and or the character. I will always love it all in some capacity because Doctor Who is my favourite show in the world, but between me, i.e. the character, and the way they yet again treated the Time Lords so badly, half of this season is some of the worst in the new series for me personally. Adrian Sturrock says, this season is a complete mixed bag for me, with my top 4 stories all being very good to excellent, and it is nice to see so many two-part stories after not having had many for quite a while. Unfortunately, Series 9 also has some very poor stories, including my bottom 2 Capaldis, Sleep No More and The Woman Who Lived, which are both bottom 20 stories for me. David Kitchen says, easily Capaldi's weakest season. I love his era overall, though. With only a few stories I'll go back to, notably Heaven Sent for Capaldi's performance and Under the Lake, which is a good adventure. At the other end, The Magician's Apprentice feels to me like a random collection of Moffat moments without a story. So enjoyment probably depends on how much you enjoy Moffat moments. Sleep No More makes just no sense at all and is visually hard to watch, and the Zygon story is full of a misunderstanding of the military, problematic politics, and some appalling race baiting from the Doctor. Luke Hammond says, easily the strongest Capaldi series, and he is a force of nature when given quality material. The tentpole beginning, middle and end stories are incredibly strong, and even the ones I didn't quite love I like a little bit more each time I revisit them. Whatever the merits of its individual components, I have to respect the whole for the way Moffat kept pushing the boundaries and tried to deliver something bold and fresh this far into his tenure. Daniel West says, despite enjoying Capaldi a lot more in this season compared to Series 8 and Jenna cementing herself as the best of the new series companions, I find this a difficult series to love. No real clunkers, but only one 10 out of 10 story. Good solid Moffat Who, though, nevertheless. And finally, Tim Ullman, and again, he always seems to sum up how I think about things. He says probably the most forgettable of the Capaldi seasons. Starts strongly and ends very strongly, but most of what comes in between is, while perfectly watchable, a little underwhelming. And I sort of do agree. I think the first two and the last two episodes are fantastic. I think Moffat's ambition can't be faulted, but I think the sort of middle eight episodes of this series kind of get bogged down a little bit in places in trying to say something. So while I think it's great that Doctor Who wants to say something, I don't think there's enough variety in this series to make it the strongest. I prefer Series 8 myself. I think there's a point in this series where, I mean, despite the variety occasionally of tone and of sort of location and genre, I think it feels a bit samey in the tenor of the stories. There all seem to be stories about this arc. And while I don't think it's wrong to address the arc all the time, the fact that the stories themselves are about the arc as opposed to just forming a part of the arc, if you see what I mean, kind of tends to make them, to my mind, a little bit too similar to each other. So there's not enough variety in this series, especially if there's so many two-parters or stories that relate to others. Anyway, Simon, what do you think of Series 9?
It's a little hard to be objective because I quickly did a bit of catch up. I'd watched quite a few fairly recently anyway, because I think we've been talking for a while about doing this episode. So a lot were about 3/4 of the series were fresh in my mind. But it's a little hard to be objective in as much as personal reaction. I'm reminded when I watch these stories of why I fell in love with this series and why I adore this series. And I have to say that I've lost that recently. It's all become a little bit. The saturation's been turned down a little bit on Doctor Who, in as much as it hasn't ensnared my passion in the same way as it did. So each of these stories, even the ones that I was a little bit dispassionate about at the time, like The Woman Who Lived, which is a very good example, and Sleep No More as well. Even though I think I can be a little less precious now and think this is really interesting Doctor Who, even those ones that don't really sing are still really great television and really great Doctor Who. So I agree, it's a really strong series. I think it's a funny shape. I think it's almost like the end of a bed where you've got two. If you imagine the side at the end of a bed where you've got the bed knobs are like the peak stories at the beginning and at the end, but in the middle you've got a flat line where it's comfortably travelling along, giving you a fairly, moderately strong series. So I do think it's a really strong series in as much as it's consistent, but it's not consistently bad by any means.
No, I think it's consistently good. But yeah, Matt would probably agree with me. I like a bit of inconsistency, I think is what I'm saying, which is why I preferred Series 8. Although I do think this is way better than Series 9, and this does contain some of my all-time favourite Doctor Who episodes. Anyway, Matt.
It's decent. I really like it. And actually, I didn't find it samey.
I can't find a right way to phrase what I mean. That's not what I mean, but yeah.
I think there is a consistent. So I think what Simon said about consistency is right, and it's whether you're happy with the level of consistency. If you like this sort of tone of story or this level of story, then you're going to enjoy the season. And I kind of do. I really like the two-parter, that kind of playful. But it's not just, they're not really two-parters. They're sort of Moffat two-parters where the second kind of acts as a mirror or a subversion or a kind of a paradox, a paradox of the first. And I think that's really clever. And actually, each of the two-parters does something slightly different as a two-parter. So one is a direct follow-on, one is here's what happened before. So it's kind of exploring the different versions of two-parters. I wasn't sure about the arc appearing. So is the arc the hybrid?
Yeah.
Because I again didn't mind that, because each story I rewatched a lot of the Zygon two-parter today, and noticed that there was in that story there was a sort of question about, is Osgood the hybrid, or is this person the hybrid? And I remember is Ashildr the hybrid.
What I meant though is that you've got a bunch of stories, and the sort of central part of each story is the question of what is the nature of being. and what is the nature of species. So it ends up, the arc ends up with the question of what is the Doctor, what is he prepared to do, and what kind of a monster is he prepared to turn himself into in order to protect his companion. And the monster that he's prepared to turn himself into is the hybrid. But in all the other episodes, there are questions of a member of a species and what are they prepared to turn themselves into. So for instance, me becomes the immortal, the Zygons become humans. In the one about Under the Lake, there's everybody's being turned into ghosts. In the first Dalek story, Davros is trying to turn the Daleks into a sort of hybrid with Time Lords. So it's always a question of taking a member of a species, transforming them somehow, and the question at the center of each story becomes, what is the nature of being then if you can transform? And I think it's a little wearing that all the stories ask that same question.
Okay, so I didn't find it wearing because I didn't notice it immediately on first viewing, so it kind of unfurls as you go, and it's only towards the end you realise the importance, and then you look back and you discover that each is again looking at a different aspect of this nature of the hybrid, and I think that's quite a clever thing to do because it doesn't get in the way of the stories. The stories still feel distinct.
Oh yes,
because of the tone, setting, and genre. So I think that works for me.
I think my point is that I enjoy them doing that, but that I have a preference for Series 8, which is less obvious about the way it goes about it.
Yeah.
Should we talk about the stories?
Okay.
In 9th place then, on 10%, James Courtney says, while it isn't brilliant, it is, and he votes it in 9th out of the 9. It is also unfairly maligned by fandom for trying something new, very much apart from the other Gators stories. It is, of course, Sleep No More in that bottom position. I think it's Gators out of his comfort zone. And while you have to applaud him for going out of his comfort zone, because almost all of his other stories are, set in history somewhere. So while you've got to applaud him for being outside of his comfort zone, and while you've got to applaud him for trying something different in Doctor Who, it did feel out of time and it does feel out of place. It is the one episode out of all 12 of these that doesn't seem to fit with the rest of the programme. Although again, maybe that question of the nature of being is there at the heart of it too. So maybe it's not so out of place as it feels. Matt, what do you think of Sleep No More?
Yeah, it's this one and Face the Raven that kind of flap around on their own, but Face the Raven is more sort of attached to the other two.
Yeah.
I didn't like Sleep No More when it was on, but I don't think I had two problems with it. Firstly, I think the idea of sort of sleep dust being the villain is a bit icky. It's just a little bit odd to me, and it's not something that captured my imagination. It's not something I've ever really thought about, and I didn't really want to see it on the screen. It didn't really interest me, and I think the direction is a little bit, because it's got that kind of, it's told through like surveillance cameras and stuff, isn't it? And I don't think the direction got that right. I don't think it's coherent enough in its direction. So I remember losing my way with it and not really following it. And so really it's one that I should go back repeatedly to get more and more out of. But because I didn't really like the central concept, I never had that sort of drive to do it. So I'm sure there's something in it. There's something in there. There are creepy moments and there's atmosphere in there, but I think it's just a bit clunkily put together.
I think like most Gators episodes, it's enjoyable enough to watch, but it's what you take away from it afterwards that's perhaps a little bit less whelming. Simon?
It's funny, the whole sleep dust thing, that's the abiding memory of me, my experience of this. Sorry, somebody's trying to get hold of me. Sorry. My abiding memory is the whole sleep dust thing just didn't sit right with me. It actually, in my head, it had less logic than the moon is an egg. I found that far more easy to swallow than this, really, which makes, leaves the feeling that it is a little bit silly in its premise, or there could have been a completely different explanation which would have made sense, because there was some really great stuff that we're trying to do here. The whole found footage thing was working pretty well, and the whole idea, particularly there's that there's that wonderful scene where you just see the guy's legs disappear into the thing's mouth, and you only just see it, almost like you're catching it out of the corner of your eye, which I think is a brilliant piece of direction. But other than that, it doesn't sit that highly in my memory. But as I said, going back to my comments at the start of the episode, I'm glad it exists, and it makes for a textured series. So
it feels backwards developed, doesn't it? So they came up with the concept for found footage and said, why would there be found footage and what can we do with that? Oh, it must be what people see rather than from cameras. Oh, in that case, the monster must be something to do with the eye. So then it's like, oh, what can we do that's to do with the eye? Oh, sleep dust. Oh, then sleep deprivation must be the reason why the monster. It's like, no, but if you'd started with the sleep deprivation, you wouldn't have come up with sleep dust monsters. You'd have come up with monsters that were something to do with the human id when it's too tired to function properly, but is being forced to function. And you'd have come up with something more like Forbidden Planet, and it would have worked. But instead, because it's been backward developed from the found footage thing, it kind of just goes off the rails.
It felt like the resolution was building to a peak, and then you get sleep dust, and it's like, oh, okay. Yeah.
You also run the risk of colliding it with Last Christmas, which has only just been on. If you start thinking too much about sleep and dreams, and so at least it does something different.
In 8th place on 13.7%, Luke Hammond votes it 8th, says really enjoyed seeing Ishilda again centuries later and exploring the emotional trauma of immortality, but unfortunately the story itself felt very by the numbers. Alistair Thwaite votes it 6th and says Capaldi and Maisie Williams are great together, but the mediocre alien brings it down. Ian Barclay votes it 5th and says great look at the effect of the Doctor's actions on a person during and after the fact. For me, it didn't matter that the story was a bit by the numbers, as they say. And in fact, I think Rufus Hound lifts it quite considerably, despite the fact that he's not in it a massive amount. But I think he lifts that aspect of it. But I think the other aspect of it, the conversations between Capaldi and Maisie Williams, I think all that stuff really, really works. And I really enjoyed this one. Simon?
Yeah, the little I watched today, just to refresh my memory, made me think, I do like that. I do like those conversations. I'm still not convinced that Maisie Williams was the best casting in this role, but that's personal. So yeah, not as, I never thought it was bad, but not as, it was more interesting than I remember. I still think the lion guy is a little bit of an odd choice, and the fact that what's his race called? Is it the Lionaras or something like that?
Leonidas, I think.
Yeah. I know we've had obvious stuff like that before, but that was a little on the nose with it. Because there was still no explanation as to why he was like a lion, really, unless they that's what they visually wanted, and they're going back to that whole Russell T Davies idea of having animal-based aliens, but it was a bit Beauty and the Beast. Which I think we said on the actual review of the episode. But yeah, it's a really interesting idea, this idea that her memory isn't working the same, that she's reduced herself to this idea of just being me. And interesting stuff.
Yeah. Matt?
I mean, I should really like this because it's an historical one, and it's set in a really interesting period that Doctor Who hasn't done very much. It feels a bit interior, a bit kind of tied down to one place, and a story about highwaymen. You really want to get the kind of full Dick Turpin experience and actually get out a bit. And this felt more like, well, they get out into the village, don't they? They don't get much further than that. It felt more like witch finders rather than or witch hunters, witch finders. Whereas this is a sort of a different period, But I remember quite liking it. I remember thinking it was fine. I didn't have a problem with Maisie Williams necessarily, because I think there was something unusual or something perfect about her being cast as such a sort of a young person, a bit like she was in Game of Thrones, a really young person, but with an old head on her.
Yeah.
And I think that works here. So her kind of look belies the age that she's lived through. So Yeah, it's fine.
I sort of agree with Simon that I don't think the performance is the best, but I do think it's a deliberate choice because that's the character she's trying to portray. So I just wonder if perhaps it's somewhere between the character and the casting, something didn't quite work. Anyway, in 7th place on 27.8%, Steve Herr votes this 6th and says the naming of the Vikings was the funniest scene since Donna finding the Doctor again. James Courtney votes it 4th and says, I think some fans misunderstand this one. The Maya are not actually meant to be intimidating. They have built up their reputation in that way by duplicitous means. The girl who died, obviously. I think this is a really, really great episode of Doctor Who, frankly. The face in the sky, the sort of Monty Python-esque nature of that. Okay, maybe that's a bit silly for Doctor Who, but I loved it anyway. The rest of it, I just think this, as a sort of 45-minute, let's get the band together to do a Magnificent Seven on these aliens that are going to come and try and kill us sort of thing. I just think it really, really works as a really simple story that actually ends up having quite profound consequences. I think it's hilarious, and I think it's really great episode for the 2 regulars as well. I really, really enjoyed this. Matt?
Well, I would have put it the other way around with The Woman Who Lived. Again, I think it's quite lightweight, but it does. Yeah, I think you're probably right. It sort of sneaks in quite consequential twists and consequential things into it. I think it would have been better if Brian Blessed had managed to make it to play Odin, because that either you go full Blessed or you go partial Blessed, and they went partial Blessed with it. But it's fine. It's a perfectly acceptable episode of Doctor Who for a mid-series episode.
This is the one was written by Jamie Matheson from the Orient Express one from the year before, and everybody went gaga for that, and yet everybody seems to dislike this, and I really don't know why. Simon, what do you think of The Girl Who Died?
It's a bit strong disliking it, I think. It does feel slightly lightweight. I mean, this is the thing with some historical adventures, particularly when you're doing something like Vikings, because everyone has their idea in their head of what the Vikings were like and that kind of thing. So it just feels like a fairly safe, scenario that the Doctor's diving into. It feels like we already know a lot about how they lived, and there's not much to learn. And then when you get, as you say, when you get a face in the sky, it can be on the cusp of silly again. But I think the comments that say it's supposed to be silly are right. But it does seem, it feels lightweight because it feels quite frivolous, because there is a lot of humor in there. But then you get this massive thing that happens with me at the end of it, which is kind of throws you a bit. So maybe at the end you've got this weird mix of taste in your mouth.
Maybe,
so you're not quite sure how it's supposed to sit within your mind.
But I loved the way they concluded the story by having imagination be the thing by which you defeat the enemy, which I thought was a fantastic bit of storytelling. And I just loved the fact that you've got this slightly lighter episode in the middle of a series, because everything else in this series is that bit heavier. I think you needed 2 or 3 episodes as light as this. You could have really done with more than just this one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Should we talk about the story that came 6th then? Because I think we're getting into the heavier stuff now. On 44.4%, James Courtney says that I have rated this so low shows how strong this series is. He votes it 6th. Luke Hammond also votes it 6th. Says that scene between Ashilda, the Doctor, and Clara still gives me chills, although the gravity of Clara's death is slightly undermined by Clara's reappearance at the end of the series. Nigel Webb votes it 5th and says would have been 2nd if Clara had actually died and not come back. Nigel, she does die. We go back to before she dies. Nothing against her, by the way. The story just doesn't work as well as she survived. But I know it gives us the main reason for the Doctor's struggle in Heaven Sent, one of the best Doctor Who episodes ever made, so I suppose I can forgive it. And Jimmy Twizzle votes it first and says moving and highly emotional conclusion to the episode, with both Capaldi and Jenna Coleman putting in wonderful performances. Face the Raven, obviously, didn't quite work for me because I couldn't quite believe in the logic of the situation, as we discussed ad infinitum at the time, so I'm not going to go over all that again. I think some of it's fantastic, obviously. I'll say, okay, the one thing I'll talk about is when Clara dies, she dies. We go back afterwards to before she dies. But although we go back, and so this is not the last time we spend an episode with Clara, this is Doctor Who. You know, we had Rose leave and then she came back. I think the most important thing is the emotional integrity of the moment when they leave. That Peter Capaldi gives such an emotionally integral performance, and that Jenna Coleman does too at the end of that episode, is what's important and what carries that. And what happens afterwards doesn't change the integrity of what happens there. That character dies in that moment. Clara gives up her life in that moment. Peter Capaldi loses his companion in that moment. And what happens afterwards doesn't change what those characters were feeling in that moment. And that's the important thing. And I think people forget that. I think you've watched something afterwards that goes back to something that happened before and looks at it from a different angle, then that thing that happens afterwards is still separated in a way from that thing before. That thing before still exists in and of itself, even though you go back to it afterwards. It's like the Hitler paradox that often comes up in time travel stories. The fact that you can talk about going back to before Hitler became the dictator that he was and take him out so that he never becomes the dictator that he was. Does that undermine the evil that Hitler brought to the world? The fact that you can have an episode talking about that, the fact that you can have time travel shows, and many have done it, including this one, who actually go back and try to do that thing, or at least talk about doing that thing, and include that character, either comedically or straight. None of that alters what Hitler did. Hitler is the evil person. And although that's not the best of comparisons to make for very obvious reasons, the reason I'm making that comparison is because those stories do that thing. And this is a case of a story doing that thing. The time paradox, where you go back to before the thing happens to change the thing that happens. And at the end of the series, we get to a point where he can't change the thing that happens. And the thing that he wants to change still goes on ahead and happens anyway, as is confirmed in Twice Upon a Time. So I think the integrity of Face the Raven is intact, regardless of how some people feel about what happened afterwards. Simon, what do you think of Face the Raven?
All I was going to say is that I remember studying A-level English lit, and feeling utterly bored, going over and over passages of certain novels and things. But Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who, or even his era of Doctor Who, would have been far more interesting. I think this is fascinating. It may not be in what was in the writer's head, but I think we kind of get a window into how the Doctor experiences his relationships with people, in as much as we get to experience, the companion's death before we've seen the whole of her life. So it's like a little window into that experience. That so what you're saying is that her death is there in stone, but we then go back to find out that there's more to her life to be, there's more life to be lived until such point as she returns to that point. Anyway, as an episode, it was, I don't know really. I quite enjoyed it. It's possibly a little more one-dimensional, or maybe a little bit, single layered. Maybe
it felt like it flopped around a bit without much of a tone, didn't it?
Yeah, maybe so. That's probably why it doesn't sit that well in my memory, or doesn't sit that defined in my memory. Let's put it that way. But I seem to remember it being really strong, and the bits that were supposed to be strong were really strong and really well dealt with. So yeah, it was okay. Yeah, it's me saying it was a strong constant season, and I'm finding it hard to sort of say something particularly defined about Face the Raven, but I think it did what it needed to do.
Yeah, let's not forget, in some ways, Face the Raven is part one of a three-part story. So you're only talking about the beginning of a narrative that goes across 2 more episodes. And obviously, I've split them up because they are all very different from each other. But none of those 3 parts, including Heaven Sent, can exist without the other 2. So it's like a trilogy of stories that can't exist without each other, rather than 3 episodes that could. But anyway, Matt.
I mean, I didn't have a so I didn't to start with. I didn't have a problem necessarily with seeing Clara die and then coming back to Clara
Yeah.
at an earlier date. I think logically that makes sense in narrative terms. I think there is an unwritten rule in Doctor Who that the Doctor doesn't go back to his dead companions and finds out what they did earlier. Even though he's a time traveller, death in Doctor Who has, generally speaking, meant death. Even because he's, and in this case, I think
this is the demonstration of that, though, because he goes back only to discover that he can't ultimately do anything about it.
Yeah. So there's something interesting there, but I do have a bit of sympathy with. There seems to be I'd have a bit of sympathy with people who think in Moffat stories there's a lot of no, this character is absolutely dead. The Doctor actually dies. Obviously, the Doctor doesn't die, but this character is absolutely dead. And then there's a bit of a time thing, and the character's not dead, or we see an earlier version of the character, or something happens. I think I don't have a problem with it happening. I have a problem with it happening every time or repeatedly. At some point, it's kind of all right to have a character, an actor die, a companion die, and then not to be seen.
But then we forget that Danny Pink does die.
Yes, yeah,
and he's not the only one. So it's
so it doesn't happen every time, but you have to admit it happens a fair amount, particularly with the main companions, with the principal companions.
Well, the thing is, I think that's what Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who is, though. It's an examination of how the programme works. And what he basically does is he takes all the aspects of the programme, all the various different bits, and examines how they work and looks like he's changing them or doing something with them. And then at the end, he just kind of puts them back exactly as they were before and says, yeah, actually, you can examine it, but you can't change it. And I think that's what this is. And I think that's what it always is. But yeah, it's because he does it all the time.
I mean,
and I think it's because he does 6 seasons as opposed to the 3 or 4 that he was going to do that it becomes more of an issue, maybe.
In fairness, I think I prefer it on this occasion because, as you said, Face the Raven's part of this is the first part of a 3-parter. So Clara's story is sort of carried on and resolved. I always defended Face the Raven on the podcast. I really like the idea of the Trap Street. I think this is a story that Neil Gaiman could have written. It's got that kind of Neverwhere feel to it, which again, as you say, flip-flops all over the place, or is kind of enigmatically tonally inconsistent.
But it's a great idea, but I don't think it's terrifically well executed.
I kind of liked it at the time. I thought it worked. I thought there was the kind of a feeling of descending into this weird realm that shouldn't exist between 2 buildings. And then it goes weirder and weirder and weirder, and then Clara dies. I think as a story goes, that's what it does. And again, as a first part of a 3-parter, it's kind of even better because it's this weird sort of prelude to the even weirder Heaven Sent.
In 5th place, then, on 45.9%, it's the Under the Lake 2-parter, which I think has all the elements for a really strong story. I just didn't feel there was any disguise about what it was doing, and it's got some really great moments and some really great ideas and some really great concepts and some really great visuals, but as an actual narrative, I just felt plodding and predictable. So for me, this was kind of the one that was less than the sum of its parts for this series. So I don't think it's terrible by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's decent. Well, better than decent Doctor Who, probably. But for me, in this series, this is probably more or less the weakest link, other than Sleep No More, in that it just didn't quite add up to something special when everything was there where it could have. Matt.
It's an odd one. I think it looked great. I really liked the ghost effects. I found it really creepy. I felt that, so it's a submerged Scottish town. I felt that the location wasn't quite nailed. It's a bit like Orphan 55, where you didn't really get a sense of place with it. And I think for me, that would have just edged it up if you got an idea of, because it's this kind of abandoned village, but you didn't see the village before it's abandoned. You don't get much of the history of it. It doesn't feel like an actual village. It feels like a sort of a mock Soviet village that they're in. But I like the idea that it plays on the idea of a two-parter. The second part, sort of flashing back to explore how the first part happened. I remember it being quite confusing at the time, because I think a week between the episodes is quite a long time to hold that information in your head. I think it's a two-parter that's made to be watched one after the other, so you can sort of get the full stuff out of it.
And also on that point, I think because also it sets certain things up, and the resolution to those things is so beyond obvious that you kind of wonder why leaving a week between the setup and the resolution was something they thought was worthwhile, because that just gave you the opportunity as an audience member to imagine that there was going to be something a bit more interesting about the resolution, other than, oh, the Doctor sets a bomb under the dam and floods the village in order to get rid of the monster. It was like, okay, what's interesting about that?
Yeah, except you didn't get much of a sense from the first part that the second part was going to be set earlier. So the Doctor does go back, but that can sort of, I think flipping them around and making the second part a prequel to the first part, that wasn't signposted in the first part, so it was still unexpected, I think.
Yeah, which is what I mean about great elements, but I don't think particularly well executed. Mind you, they did do some heavy editing on this story, apparently. I don't know quite why. Maybe it just overran badly. And so maybe some of that execution was lost in the mix. Simon, what did you think of it?
This is the one story that seems to get better and better when I come back to it. And maybe it's because I don't.
Fair enough.
I don't overanalyze it. Although on the last little bit that I watched, there's this whole idea of these are supposedly souls that have been absorbed or being used by the Fisher King, and that's what the Doctor's got. Why the Doctor's got a real problem. And you're probably right that doesn't come across properly. That somehow doesn't come out in the dialogue of exactly how that works, and maybe that's why it doesn't sit quite right. But as Matt's right. The way it looks, the way it's directed, the creepy bits are really creepy. I think it all works really, really well, and I just find it really entertaining, really, to the point where I want my daughter to watch it, because I think she'll really like it, because I think it'll hit all the spots for her. I remember the second part being a bit of a letdown compared to the first time, but it does work better watching the two parts together. It feels more coherent. So yeah, I really like it. And this idea of the second part being a prequel, there seems to be a prequel thing going on. Even what we were just talking about with Clara, when Clara finally gets plucked out of her time stream, that's almost like a prequel thing. It's almost like an analysis of the prequel, because you think to yourself, well, what's the point in watching a story of what happened before when you know how it's going to end anyway?
Well, this is one of the things that Stephen Moffat likes to do. He likes to foreshadow how things are going to resolve by doing similar things earlier in the series. So you've got this here, and then Saigon two-parter. You've got what happens with Clara in that one. Both of those are sort of sideways examples of what's going to happen with Clara in Hellbent. So yeah, he's definitely foreshadowing. I mean, I've got to assume it's deliberate, because I think Stephen Moffat was very much asking the writers for specific things with these stories, to the point where he even steps in and co-writes couple of the episodes in order to make sure he gets what he wants. So this does feel like very much a very, very authored series of Doctor Who. Should we talk about the top 4 then? The ones that came above 50%. In 4th place, on 54.8%, Hellbent. I think one of the 3 greatest episodes of Doctor Who of all time, frankly. I love the way this one resolves. I love the disguise in it, and I love the message that it gives. And although you come back later, and again, this is like, does this undermine it? When you get to Twice Upon a Time, you discover that Clara really did go back and really did die in Trap Street, and she's still wearing the same clothes, and therefore it can't be too long after she goes off in Hellbent. So at the end of this story, where she looks like she's got all of time and space in front of her, I don't think there's really that much of time and space in front of her at all, frankly. But I love the message it gives, and I think for Doctor Who to look like it's going to the darkest of all possible places, and then to pull this magical message out of the hat with such disguise and in such a imaginative episode, all that stuff in the cafe between the Doctor and Clara there as the waitress and with the guitar and that, it just takes my breath away that after 5 series on Doctor Who, Stephen Moffat can still pull something this astonishing out of the hat. Simon.
I need to rewatch it because I think it's a bit. Am I right? It's a bit of a runaround in some respects. And I remember there being lots of lovely things like escaping with the old TARDIS and things like that. The resolution, I'm not sure about. It was probably. I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure how well it sits with me. I must rewatch it if I'm being completely honest.
I think it has an astonishing resolution. It's the opposite of the Donna resolution. You know, at the end of the Donna story,
cool.
where the Doctor takes the decision out of Donna's hands. Here, Clara insists on deciding for herself.
And of course, it's the resolution that we've been leading up to with Clara. This whole idea of Clara becoming the Doctor. So actually, it's the Ace story, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a 21st century style. And
it comes from a place where you just can't imagine it happening, and somehow Stephen Moffat makes it completely logical the way you end up getting to that place. I just thought it was amazing. Matt.
Yeah, it's all right. I really liked the Gallifrey stuff. I liked Stephen Moffat did his usual sort of Stephen Moffat thing of taking stuff from 5 Doctors and from previous Gallifrey stories and adding a bit of a creepy twist to them. I think it started quite slowly, especially if you've just watched Heaven Sent, which is obviously quite a sort of serious meditative story, quite low character. And then Hellbent takes a bit of time to get the motor running. It doesn't really drop the Doctor into the action. It kind of drops them on the edge of the action, and they had that kind of man with no name
standoff basically
beginning, which is fine in retrospect when you watch it again, knowing what's to come. But when you're watching it, you're kind of willing him to actually, get into the capital and start doing things. But yeah, when it does get going, it's really good.
In 3rd place, on 58.1%, Steve Herr votes it first. Says how to bring back an old monster and totally invigorate them by making their story topical while still remaining within the constructs of the original conception. It's the Zygon 2-parter, Invasion and Inversion, which I think is a great, fun, daft runaround in large part, and then you get to that final scene. But I love the way, and Steve Herr says it takes what the Zygons were that we knew and makes them really topical to the world in which we live today. And in fact, just as topical as ever now as it was when it was on a few years ago. And then you get that speech at the end, and some of it's a bit daft, but then it's Doctor Who, so it wouldn't be Doctor Who if there weren't bits that were a bit daft. The Clara in the sort of alternative reality, and the Clara as the double, in the second episode. Again, it's all stuff we've seen before. It was a bit Russell T Davies, if truth be told. It was like Silence in the Library meets the Sontaran Stratagem, very Series 4 Russell T Davies, but also very Moffat-y at the same time, of course. I don't know, I think this is a fantastic bit of Doctor Who. There's one bit I didn't like, but I think that's down to the director and or the actors, which is the standoff outside the building with the sort of hairy stuff. That didn't sell itself somehow. That just seemed a bit weird. You know, the bit where, am I really your mother? No, obviously you're not really my mother, but can you shoot me because I've taken on the guise of your mother? Yeah, I wasn't sold on that scene, but apart from that, the rest of it, I think it's fantastic. And I love the fact that it's 2 episodes and it takes the time to just do a lot of really daft and crazy stuff, frankly. Very Doctor Who type stuff before coming up with this sort of last 15 minutes that elevates it to an entirely different level. Matt?
So this is one that I rewatched. I rewatched Zygon Invasion and about 15 minutes of Zygon Inversion. So I haven't rewatched the whole thing. I knew that David Kitchen had a problem with the politics in this, and I was trying to watch it so I could try and understand what his problem was, because I didn't spot it the first time. I know that it's got a lot of complicated politics about immigration in it, and I think certainly the first episode, I can't quite unravel that. I think there is dodginess in there somewhere, but actually it's less immigration, they're more sort of in witness protection. There are moments I didn't like the standoff bit outside the building, but I didn't like the Doctor in that bit, because the Doctor was very sort of passive. He was stood at the back and kind of let him get on with it, and you get the feeling that they could have quite easily have massacred these Zygons, and he wouldn't have done anything. So I didn't quite know what the Doctor was doing in these episodes. On the other hand, I loved the pacing. I loved the atmosphere. I really liked the idea of the story. I liked the duplicate Clara and the sort of the double bluff in the first episode, which on first viewing I didn't get straight away, but obviously it's sort of signposted. I like Osgood. Bring Osgood back. I really like Osgood, and she could so easily fit into any period of Doctor Who. And yeah, I kind of preferred it to something like, so Spyfall has a similar kind of setting, feel, tone. I preferred it to Spyfall. I thought it was a better paced, more. It had more substance to it. I just haven't quite worked out what that substance is, and I'm wary of going to, and you know, obviously something's in there.
One of the problems that people had or have with this story is that the Zygons are forced to take on human form, which is a bit like, because the analogy is with people from the Middle East. Assimilation. And
but I saw it as witness protection. So they were kind of forced to take on human form because they were sort of aware that they were kind of traitors to the Zygon. There was a sort of a hard line Zygon race, and they were forced to sort of pretend to be humans because they're hiding out from the bad Zygons, which I thought made sense if you see them as kind of witnesses in danger rather than a direct analogy for immigrants. But I think that's complicated in the second episode when they keep on making analogies with immigration, and so I think that's where it's complicated. That's where it's confused. Is sometimes they're an analogy for immigrants, and sometimes they're not, and it kind of happily moves between the two.
And I think part of that is just it's a function of what the story has to be, because you couldn't tell the story with the Zygons being Zygons all the time. And you probably couldn't afford, or logistically it probably wouldn't be practical to make the story if there were Zygons all the time either. Anyway, Simon,
I think it's in essence a a very mature piece of Doctor Who. But where it kind of fudges, as you say, is you get moments like that showdown outside where, you supposedly that you don't know whether they're, they come out of the building pretending to be someone. Oh no, you're going to shoot your mother. Which is simplistic to the point of being really, really obvious. And
Yeah.
you have to bear in mind that you are creating this program to be watched by the average viewer as well. So, maybe that's why it's there, which is a shame. And children, yeah, which is a shame in some respects, because you are touching on such complex issues, which is fantastic that Doctor Who can be this brave, and it is a really great two-parter. I mean, it's kind of the Hungry Earth cranked up to 9. I think it's kind of what that could have been, or maybe Hungry Earth with a really good part 2 as well. So yeah, it's just brilliant Doctor Who, and as one of our listeners said, it's a really brilliant way of bringing the Zygons back. And of course, Osgood is the hybrid in this story, which I think is a brilliant kind of psychological leap, a brilliant concept. This idea, because you don't know whether this is a Zygon or a human, in essence, it becomes the hybrid, because it's neither one, or it's almost Schrodinger's kind of species, because no one will ever know which one is the one who survived. Or by the end of it, of course, whether it's 2 Zygons or whether it's a human and a Zygon.
Yeah. Of course, the other thing about the solution this story presents being a flawed one is that's better drama than if it presents a perfect solution, right? And it's more realistic drama than if it presents a perfect solution. And it doesn't have to be that, because what people will do is they'll see an imperfect solution in a story and they'll beat the writer about the head, as if the writer's presenting that solution as being that writer's preferred solution, rather than just the solution that's right for the story. So this solution for the Zygon problem that's presented here, being flawed, I think just allows the story to happen, rather than if they found a perfect solution, where's the story in that? Do you know what I mean? Anyway, second place, 64.8%. Ian Charles votes this one fourth. It says there is a version of this, which is a single episode long without Missy or Clara or Davros opening his eyes he shouldn't have, which is one of the great stories. This is good, but overloaded. Ian Barclay, on the other hand, votes this third and says Daleks and Missy, I don't think I could ask for more. And James Courtney, who also votes it third, says one of the best uses of Davros on television, if not the best. Julian Bleach is magnificent. And going back to something else that I think it was David Kitchen said about this being lots of Moffat moments, but no story. This is a story. This is a story about a sting, and about a sting that's being taken out on the Doctor, and the Doctor catches it and turns it back on the person who's performing it on him. I think it's a terrific story. I think people looked at the stuff, because Moffat always throws a lot of things in. I think people looked at the stuff that Moffat was throwing in and missed the plot. Somehow, I think they missed the plot, or missed the importance of the plot. All the other stuff that Stephen Moffat throws in is to do with ultimately facilitating that plot. I think The Magician's Apprentice and The Witch's Familiar are two of the best episodes of Doctor Who ever made, frankly. They're in my top 10 along with Hell Bent. I think they're absolutely amazing pieces of television. Simon, what do you think?
I think it offers up a lot of the stuff that a lot of people were going gaga about on Series 10, where they were saying, "Oh, these are far more straightforward stories, and it's a bit more adventure," and it's a really straightforward, rip-roaring story where the Doctor, as you say, is coaxed in, and the whole idea is that that Davros wants to create this kind of Time Lord Dalek hybrid, and then the city gets and the Doctor sorts it out by turning the city against itself.
Yeah,
it's so straightforward and such a pure story, and that's all going on, and you've got all this lovely glitter being, Moffat glitter being scattered overhead to make it all nice and to keep us Moffat fans happy, and because it is so funny and so beautifully written. I've so missed all this level of writing. Again, this is another one that gets better and better every time I watch it. I just think it's staggering, to the point where the bit, where Davros comes clean and suddenly, it's sucking all the energy out of the Doctor, it feels all a bit Doctor Who hackneyed, to be honest. And yet that's kind of pure Doctor Who, really. So it's really, really great. I very much enjoy this one.
Oh, and I love the moment when he opens his eyes as well. I think that's a fantastic. Yeah,
it's one of those moments, isn't it? If you're a writer and you think, well, why doesn't he ever open his eyes? And then he does. It's just brilliant. It's just brilliant. And again, it's one of these things you can be precious about it if you like, but well, why not? Why not?
Yeah, I really liked it, and I rewatched The Magician's Apprentice recently, and I thought that it was looking at the key issues of Genesis of the Daleks, but slightly more consistently. So Genesis of the Daleks pretends to be centered around this idea of, has the Doctor got the right to destroy the Daleks? And I kind of agree. In the context of that, I agree with Sarah Jane that of course he has the right to destroy the Daleks. They're the most evil beings in the universe. He should push the two wires together. Here, they start with that moral dilemma, and then the whole story kind of explores it. So it does something. It goes back to Genesis of the Daleks, but it does something that Genesis of the Daleks should have done. So instead of running back and forth between two domes and having Harry step in a clam, it actually does something, does something interesting with it. So yeah, I think it's great. When does Davros open his eyes? Is it after the Doctor drains a bit of regeneration energy, or is that before?
Just before.
Okay,
It's
so
when,
I didn't
because
mind
Davros
that
is trying to persuade the Doctor that Davros needs the regeneration energy for himself. He wants the Doctor to feel sorry for him, and in order to do so, he opens his eyes, and that's a brilliant moment, because what Davros is trying to do is demonstrate for how many hundreds of years he's been living in this way when he shouldn't.
Yeah,
I just think it's a brilliant piece of drama at that moment.
And also Davros is preying on something the Doctor displays in Genesis of the Daleks. So Davros has done a very Davrosy thing, and he's spotted a weakness in the Doctor from his very first encounter, and he's kind of played the long game to this point, and he's kind of playing on that kind of sympathy, and I think that works perfectly.
In first place, on 80.4%, not as high as I was expecting. I thought this one might be vying for the highest score we could have had, but not as high as that. Jimmy Twizzle, for instance, votes it fourth. Says, magnificent performance from Capaldi, but entertained more by other stories, however worthy and groundbreaking it is. The other three who comment vote it first, though. David Ewan says, a tour de force for a fine actor, moving, scary, and unbelievably Doctor Who-ish, yet not. Luke Hammond, don't think I've ever been so drawn into a revelation or wanted to proudly tell everyone I knew to watch an episode of Doctor Who. Sublime. And James Courtney says, I've often thought that the Capaldi era is Doctor Who, the art house years. Nothing exemplifies this more than Heaven Sent. Also, I can't be the only one that thinks the Doctor is being followed around by the decaying corpse of his human mother. Heaven Sent, obviously, which I love the examination of how grief works, and how Stephen Moffat takes that examination of how grief works and sort of shows a physical version, a geographical version of that grief turning into anger and then determination. I think that aspect of it is brilliant. I actually think the mechanics of the episode are a little too obvious, and so for me this one slightly underperforms. I don't think this is nearly as good as Hellbent or The Magician's Apprentice, because I do find the mechanics of the story just a little bit perfunctory, despite loving the sort of almost matrixy nature of where the story takes place. Simon, what Heaven Sent?
I'm glad it exists. It's an example of Doctor Who doing something completely new. Again, still surprising you after all these years. I think a huge amount of credit needs to go to Rachel Talalay, or
Talalay.
Talalay.
I think it's Talalay, yeah.
Talalay, sorry. But yeah, it's really great, and I think it's a great piece of television. I think it's one of those things. I think you do catch yourself sitting there saying, "This is a great piece of television," and forgetting maybe that you're supposed to be watching Doctor Who and just enjoying it. So in that respect, maybe it's showing off a little bit. But I really enjoyed it, and I love the poetic quality of the script, and as I say, the way it's filmed, and the fact that it's just this one-off thing, and that whole, it's one of those stories that makes your mind have to make a bit of a leap as to what's actually going on. That this idea that the Doctor is actually dying over and over again. So the Doctor who comes out at the end isn't actually the Doctor.
Oh, I was going to bring that up in a moment.
It's a recreation.
He is. It goes back to what I've always said about how teleportation must work. In teleportation, you have to kill the person that you're teleporting, and then you have to basically conjure atoms out of the air in order to recreate the person at the other end. So the person at the other end is not the person who was at the original teleport.
Yeah.
And so Heaven Sent definitively kills the Doctor before basically inventing 6 billion new ones, or however many. Well, if it's 6 billion years and it takes place across a day, it's 6 billion times 365, right? So I can't even do the maths on that. That's a rather more. That's something like 22 billion Doctors.
I suppose it depends whether you think this technology is literally reality within this thing, or whether it's kind of almost like a Matrix type affair, whether it's just data in there or something like that, and it's only real to the person inside, but who knows.
But then he comes out at the other end from here, so it's still not the him that went in who comes out. So even if it's only one remove because it takes place in a Matrix space. Anyway, we're getting way into Matt.
I mean, it's the Prestige, isn't it? So it's that kind of, except the Prestige goes one stage further, in that the new person has to kill the old person and take his place.
Yes.
I mean, technically,
and it doesn't work.
Technically, the Doctor teleports in at the beginning. So if that's as JR says, that's just doing exactly the same as this kind of profession. I thought it was quite good. I thought it's sort of miraculous, one of those miracles that this was shown on a Saturday evening, because it's completely unlike Casualty or anything else that would have been shown on Saturday evening for years and years. I think it's not as scary as it could have been. I think Stephen Moffat seems to watch a hell of a lot of contemporary, not for children horror movies, and then asks himself, how can I make this suitable for children? So he's clearly watched It Follows, but he's taken the suitable for children really scary thing out of It Follows, which is the thing that's coming towards you looks human, but there's something wrong with them. And he's kind of gone for a fly monster. If it had been something like Clara slowly walking towards the Doctor in a sinister fashion, that could have been slightly more unsettling. I also think it's not quite a labyrinth, this castle. It's not quite twisty-turny. It's all a bit samey.
Yeah.
And I think if it had been a bit more of an unusual space, or a bit more of a David Lynchy space, that would have been more creepy. On the other hand, I've watched a lot of horror movies, and I have high tolerance for things that freak me out. So if I was 7 or 8, this would have scared the bejesus out of me.
I think when he was writing it, he must have had Castrovalva in mind, but the execution of it doesn't really give you that sense that Castrovalva tries to, of everything moving around.
I think the idea that it's a limited space is quite clever, because I think that feeds into children's fear of, if something's following you around your house, there's only so far to go. There's only so many hiding spaces.
It is, but I don't think it isn't limited enough. So it's an idea that the space should be constantly moving. And I didn't get that sense. I actually got the feeling like he was in a sort of small, stately home, running from room to room. I didn't get a sense of. It's a bit of a paradox. I didn't get a sense of the geography of the space, but I didn't get the sense that the geography was changing either. I just got a sense that it was moving from sort of set to set a little bit. But
being a castle, you can just keep going around.
Yeah,
you know, it wasn't as if he could corner you anywhere.
Yeah,
because it's a castle. It's kind of a round space almost.
But the CCTV stuff worked for me. I like that. That kind of saved it a little bit. But it is still one of the more inventive stories in Doctor Who's history, and it's a miracle that it exists. It's up there with sort of Ghostlight and Edge of Destruction as being a really unusual sort of, experimental story.
Oh, and it's undoubtedly a great episode. I just think it, for me, it's slightly overshadowed by the even great episodes that come before it at the beginning of the season and immediately after it with Hellbent, which I think takes, where Heaven Sent doesn't surprise me because I can feel where it's headed and I watch it going to the place where I knew it was going to go almost. Hellbent, I can't see where it's headed, and the place it's going is so much better than any place I could have imagined it ending up. So Hellbent just completely overshadows it for me. But yeah, it's still a great episode, right? Any final thoughts on Series 9? Matt, Simon? Matt?
I mean, I still think the two-parter structure is something that could be repeated, particularly if you're this inventive with the two-parters. I think this is almost more consistent than Flux was. It's more of a feeling of being a unified whole than actually a lot of seasons of Doctor Who. Even something like season 7 or series 7, that is sort of a story to story to story. This feels like it's kind of got a reason. It feels like it's been planned. It doesn't feel like it's been kind of designed or sketched up on the hoof. It feels like there's been some thought behind it. The individual stories or the individual episodes, on the other hand, some of them feel like they've been sketchily directed, or they've been rushed, or they haven't quite worked and they've had to be fixed in the edit. But the fact that it opens with 2 really great episodes, it's got 2 strong, for me, Zygon episodes in the middle, and then the last 3 episodes are brilliant. I mean, that's a pretty good hit rate for a 12 episode series.
Could this have worked if it wasn't Clara? Because obviously there was a lot of talk of Jenna Coleman leaving. This feels like it was designed to be Clara's last series.
I think it could have worked. It would have just been a mysterious character who may or may not be the hybrid. They just throw in a kind of a Romana-ish companion, and you've still got that kind of, this person is bad for the Doctor. This person shouldn't be with the Doctor. And with a bit of tweaking, I think it would have worked.
Yeah, I just think it feels so much more satisfying because it's Clara. I know some people were having a problem with her by this time, but I think she's absolutely amazing across this, I think. Simon, what do you think? Final thoughts?
I just hope that with some of the little, the things that was happening in the Zygon story, the social comment, and and Heaven Sent for obvious reasons, I hope that Russell T Davies has been taking note while he's been a viewer as to some of the stuff that's been really working well. So I hope we get to see more of that kind of thing where Doctor Who completely throws you and does something that you weren't expecting. So so it's a really great season, despite misgivings about certain little nitpicking things. But weren't we lucky?
Yeah. Right, we've got our next poll, which we'll be recording, is season 14, which will probably be closed by the time this is out on our audio feed. If you're watching this on video, you've probably just about got time to vote. What will be up on our feed instead is our poll of winners, because we're coming up to our 10th birthday, and I thought our 10th birthday episode could be the results of our poll of winners. So if you go to our Facebook page, after this is out on audio, this probably won't be up immediately when the video goes out. Go along to our Facebook page. There'll be a list of all the stories that have won one of our polls. And what I'm asking people to do is just vote for their top 10 in order, as many people as possible. So even if you've not voted on one of these, if you're on our Facebook page, or if you're listening to this now, go along to our Facebook page and find it and vote on this, because I'd like to get, I mean, it won't be definitive, but I'd like to get a good idea of our listeners' favourites from all the stories that have won the polls. So your top 10 from a list of about, 36, 38 stories that have won these various polls. Let us know. And by the time we come to record our birthday episode in about a month's time from when we're recording this, we'll have some idea of our listeners' favourites from those poll-winning stories. Until next week, then, when we do season 14, I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.